I want to start up top by asking you, Holly, can you explain to the uninitiated what is geoengineering and why are more people seeming to be talking about it right now in this moment?
Well, geoengineering is an umbrella term that refers to a bunch of different techniques that would influence the climate intentionally at scale. So we've been hearing a lot more about carbon dioxide removal. Whether that is or isn't geoengineering is a matter of great debate. Then there's something called solar geoengineering, which involves reflecting some amount of sunlight back into space to cool the planet.
So why is an issue of great debate whether carbon dioxide removal should fall under the umbrella of geoengineering?
I mean, geoengineering has acquired, for many reasons, a taboo, so to speak. So, you could also remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere without it being necessarily an engineering type scheme.
So what would that look like? Reforestation or...
Yeah, or farming in ways that put more carbon back into the soils because the soils have lost a tremendous amount of carbon through industrial agriculture. So whether that is or is not geoengineering, I guess, is in the mind of the beholder, but it doesn't necessarily need to be an engineering scheme.
So Holly mentioned the fact that this area has been somewhat controversial or perceived that way in the past. Femi, you write and teach about the ethical implications. You have a philosophy background. What exactly are the reasons why this has been a controversial subject? And do you think it should be?
So I think the reasons why it's been a controversial subject has a lot to do with who is in a position to get messaging out about these kinds of technologies and approaches and techniques and who isn't. So chances are, if you've heard about a geoengineering scheme, or, I come down on the side of thinking that carbon removal is something different, but who cares, right? If you've heard about carbon removal or solar radiation management, chances are you heard about that from somebody well-funded by a, fossil fuel entity or something like that, right? And there's obvious upsides for them if people are talking about things like carbon dioxide removal or geoengineering, because, it might get around the perspective that, hey, we can do that instead of doing all the stuff that's going to mess with our profits, right? So that's the reason for the debate and the controversy. And I would say there should be debate and controversy, right? That is a completely reasonable thing to politically respond to. But I think the question we have to ask is less about why ExxonMobil would talk about those kinds of things. It's clear why they would. But why is it that so many scientists and people who model climate at scale are talking about those technologies, right? And that's going to lead us to a different set of answers and a different set of questions than I think the purely political analysis will.
Part of my confusion when I started looking into this is that I guess I didn't really realize that this technology was anywhere close to being viable. Holly, my understanding was that these kinds of technological innovations were brought up, to Femi's point, often as a way to provide an off-ramp of sorts or a release valve for corporations who are under an enormous amount of political pressure to meet the carbon emissions deadlines or cutoff points set by the IPCC guidelines, right? And that, okay, well, we don't have to cut emissions if we can capture carbon in these other ways. But I thought that part of why that argument was so kind of pretextual, or it was a pretense to support those kind of technologies, was in part because the technologies didn't even really exist yet. How close are we to actually being able to do a lot of this stuff?
Well, obviously things like reforestation or soil carbon sequestration we can do right now. Then there's carbon capture and storage, which is used for both carbon removal and mitigation. So you can put equipment on a cement plant or a steel plant that will take out the carbon dioxide. Then you have to transport it and store it underground. That already exists. It's existed for several decades. We just haven't bothered to do it because nobody wanted to make people pay for the pollution, right? So that's something that's established that needs to be done. Then you can also use this carbon capture and storage with a bioenergy at a bioenergy power plant, say, or with something called direct air capture, which are machines that would take carbon directly from the atmosphere. And those are newer, but they do exist at a demonstration scale. Some of the first large-scale plants are being built right now. So the technology's there. It's just very expensive. And if you can pollute for free, why would you be removing the pollution?
When you say it's very expensive, I mean, part of the conversation, part of the thing, one of the variables that gets left out of the conversation, rather, is the fact that there is an enormous cost to not doing anything about climate change, right? And so the question, it seems to me, the policy question at least, is, are these technologies less expensive than the externalities that are currently being absorbed by the rest of us for inaction? What are the cost barriers to doing some of these, implementing some of these types of carbon capture like? And what is the capacity of these technologies to actually offset the enormous volumes of carbon that are still being emitted daily?
The first part of that on the cost, something like direct air capture, there's a plant in Switzerland that's doing this for about $600 a ton. Optimists say that, well, if we built this out by scale, at scale, we'd have this learning by doing, where that could come down to $100 to $200 a ton, which is more in line with what a reasonable price on carbon should be. In terms of barriers to scaling that up, there's not really, it doesn't look like there's a barrier in terms of geological storage capacity. So there's enough places underground where you could store the carbon. It gets injected deep underground. But I think the barriers are going to be energy, because it takes energy to run these processes, and land for renewable energy to run it. So at a time when we need all of our renewables just to decarbonize and electrify everything, it is a burden to say, okay, now we need even more than that to remove the carbon, which is just one of the many reasons why we can't think of this at all as a substitute for reducing emissions.
And are there risks to implementing these technologies? You say that, the storage would happen underground. Obviously, as a novice, the first thing that starts springing to my head is the fracking discourse and the downstream effects of injecting, air into rock crevices to, harvest natural gas. Are there potential, what kind of potential negative effects could come from some of these technologies? And I understand that there's a diversity of technology here, so feel free to take the time to answer with respect to some of the different types of things that are being suggested.
Yeah, on the geologic storage side, most geologists think that this is both something that can be managed and something that needs to be studied further. And what we had with fracking was just this kind of wild operation with, all these new companies going out kind of doing it like crazy. That's not the most professional way to say it, but it was really just this huge wave of extraction that wasn't well regulated. And so I think that the same thing is true for carbon capture and storage. There's a right way and a wrong way to do it. And most of the scientists I speak with think that if you had proper monitoring, there already is a lot of regulation on the books around these sorts of things already, but that part could be manageable. So most people think that the risks are really these social risks of reducing energy for mitigation.
And with respect to SRM, the solar radiation management?
Yeah, that's a whole different story.
Okay. Well, what is that story?
Yeah, so basically, this is something that scientists have only been understanding through models. So solar geoengineering in the most studied form would involve having specially designed airplanes that could carry sulfur up into the stratosphere, where it would be released and circulate around the globe. So there would be these particles that would be up there for a year or so until they would fall back to Earth. So this would be, picture a continuous operation, a small fleet of aircraft continually flying to put more, basically a blanket of pollution intentionally to shield the Earth. So the risks with that, I mean, I think there's unknown unknowns, right? We don't know because we haven't done very much research, especially research that's outside a computer model. So that would be impacting the amount of sunlight that's coming down to Earth. There needs to be ecological studies on what that does to plants, to crops. There's also a special risk in the form of a termination effect or a termination shock. So if solar geoengineering was done for many years, but suddenly interrupted, the warming that was being suppressed would come all at once, which would be much more of a shock to ecosystems and human systems than a more gradual warming.
So Femi, you've written about some of these ethical concerns with this technology yourself as someone who focuses on the disparate impact of environmental harms on the global south, and also the fact that the implementation of a lot of these technologies is likely to come from the global north, which is able to invest more in these technologies. Can you talk a little bit about what the ethical concerns are there with respect to implementing these kinds of reforms?
I think the big concerns are around land and land use. One of the things that I've been thinking about in particular with carbon removal, but something that actually is quite more general to climate policy, right? It's something that's going to show up when we're talking about biofuels, when we're talking about reforestation and afforestation, is just the politics of land ownership. So there was, the story I always tell is there was capital flight after 2008, the big financial crisis that happened. And surges in commodity prices sent capital all across the world. And one of the things that got bought up in this period of capitalist crisis was land, some in South America, some in East Asia. Nowhere was harder hit than Africa. By some measures, something like 25% of the arable land on the African continent is owned in large-scale land acquisition.
25%, you said?
25%.
Wow.
Which will increase as the Sahel desertifies, as climate crisis intensifies, right? The percentage of land that's being owned by these large-scale land acquisitions. So when we're talking about things like afforestation, we're talking about things that are or reforestation, right? You're just planting trees. We're talking about things that are on face innocuous, right? But when we're talking about planting trees, say, instead of growing crops, right? When we're talking about contracting the land available for food production, and when we're talking about an international system that doesn't seem to particularly care who eats and who doesn't, as I think we would all agree is true of our system. We're actually talking about something with deep political implications. So, I think the idea that we're dealing with something simpler than technology when we're talking about, natural solutions of afforestation or reforestation, that we're going to the simple past of land politics is an odd thing to hear from the perspective of somebody who studies colonialism, right? Like, land politics, land use politics, land ownership politics is like OG injustice,
So what kind of policy solutions would you design if you were in charge for managing the kind of conflicts of interest that are emerging between the folks in the global south who are largely disproportionately not responsible for the crisis that we're in, and the fact that they are, disproportionately being burdened with the effects? I think I was reading that the continent of Africa is responsible for 3% of total global emissions since the 18th century.
I mean, if it were up to me, this is a fun exercise.
What does Dictator Femi have for us?
I mean, there are people who are like calling for climate Leninism, and maybe maybe that's the idea. But if it were up to me, I think at bottom this is a distributive issue, right? So there are biophysical requirements on what kinds of things that we can do going forward as a species on this planet, right? Unless somebody has some special numbers I haven't seen, consumption is going to have to go down. Renewable electricity is going to have to go way up. Growth is going to have to go down, especially in the global north, et cetera, et cetera. And the question is, well, who gets to do the growing? Which parts of the world gets to do the growing and which parts of the world have to make space for that by doing the contracting, right? Which parts of the world gets to develop and maybe, in a way that involves hopefully as much renewables as we can have, but maybe doesn't just use renewables, right? Because they haven't gotten the chance to develop any infrastructure up until the present moment, right? And what do we do in the global north to accommodate that, right? So if it were me, I would say, places like the US and the EU have to pretty much entirely slash emissions. And they have to take on their fair share of the burden, not only of cutting emissions, but of actually removing past emissions. And I don't see any other way that the math is going to work.
Well, Alex, let me ask you, as someone who covers real world, everyday politics and is on this environmental beat, we've been having a lot of intensive conversations over the past few weeks around the infrastructure bill, and you've seen a level of pushback from progressive groups about the fact that they feel like climate interventions aren't being appropriately considered in the infrastructure bill, a level of pushback that you haven't seen around certain other progressive priorities like a $15 minimum wage or the public option that Joe Biden ran on. Do you see this infrastructure bill as a moment that is actually going to accommodate some of the concerns that we're talking about here? And has geoengineering or carbon capture technology, CDR, what have you, been a part of any of the discussions as you've witnessed them?
I don't think that you're going to see the infrastructure bill highly prioritize these things at the scale that I think would be necessary to make a significant impact with them. You have seen, the president put out his budget request to Congress with some significant, if again, insufficient to make a meaningful impact requests for money for funding for these things. So carbon dioxide removal, for example, I think was marked for something like $65 million, which is a $65 million increase from what it presently is. and that is notable. And separately from the budget process, you saw the National Academies of Science come out with a request for for seed funding for a program that would look into solar radiation management and begin the research around that. Now, would you see the same kind of pushback against funding for these sorts of things, or to preserve funding for these sorts of things that you are seeing, in the activism and the advocacy around things like, renewables deployment? No, these are things that are quite, I think, controversial to that progressive set, and those are advocates that largely fear that funding for these things is a substitute for mitigation funding. I don't think you'll see it in the infrastructure bill, and I don't think you'll see the people clamoring for more climate funding pushing for it to be there either.
So is the skepticism legitimate? Because I will admit that, until I frankly saw a segment on this issue on the Hill by my former boss at The Intercept, Ryan Grimm, my attitude would have been that of a skeptic. I would have said, well, these kinds of technologies, they're pie in the sky. They don't really exist yet. And ultimately, they are being pushed by polluters in order for them to, be able to do less in terms of cutting emissions. It's basically an off-ramp for them doing the harder thing. How should skeptical listeners work through those concerns? How should you handle, I think, a really healthy skepticism that comes from the fact that the people who have historically pushing this angle have been the ones who have wanted to avoid actually cutting emissions.
I'll note with irony that I'll be explaining this off the various conversations that I've had with the two other people on this panel who have really shaped my thinking. I mean, I really shared that skepticism for a long time, and with good reason. I think that those that have been promoting a lot of these technologies are also those who have been actively lobbying with even more money against mitigation of emissions in the first place. And it is a simplistic logic, but a sensible logic to fear the moral hazard of, pursuing something that would make, less necessary that difficult process of mitigation, which has been hard enough to deal with without these technologies being ready for deployment. I would say that my journey away from that skepticism as a hardline view actually began with reading Holly's book, After Geoengineering, which, was the first time I had been presented with arguments that, just expanded the political imagination of how these things could be governed and how these things could be deployed beyond a very cynical neoliberal framework for thinking about it. And I think that exposing yourself to those ideas about how it might be different and how it could be deployed in a way for public good, as opposed to as an accounting trick to allow for increased emissions, or as a way for companies that are most responsible for climate denialism and climate obstruction to remain relevant and necessary. So, I think considering the other ways that this could be done and who ought to be funding it to get to that point are things worth considering.
When you say who should be funding it to get to that point, are you talking about whether or not this should be a government-backed project or one that should be left to private industry?
I'm talking about availing public funds to research this in a transparent and accountable way. That the failure to address things like carbon removal or solar radiation management at the regulatory or public funding level doesn't make them go away. That doesn't seal Pandora's box. It only makes it more likely that it'll be done by unaccountable actors. And in many cases, carbon dioxide removal is, as we've discussed so far, pretty advanced. Solar radiation management is being actively researched by billionaires and could be, in theory, deployed quite cheaply. And I think in when considering these things and thinking about the expanding your political imagination of how it may unfold, it helps to even look at fiction. The great sci-fi writer Kim Stanley Robinson based his most latest novel first and foremost on a historic heat wave that hits India and compels the Indian government then to begin solar radiation management on its own without a real global agreement on how to do that. And I think exposing yourself to those possibilities, doesn't necessarily clarify the unknown unknowns, but helps to take stock of what the stakes are with something like this.
A lot of Rumsfeld references today. R.I.P. Femi, you've written about what some of the kind of ethical implications are of individual countries making independent, discrete decisions about whether to implement carbon capture technology. Can you walk us through what might happen if something like what Alex just described took place, if one or a handful of countries like India decided to go down this road without there being some global agreement about what the climate goals are, what temperature goals were being, they were striving to meet, et cetera?
So one of the things that's, I think, especially true about SRM, and the reason why I think people kind of want to treat it in a category of its own, is that, as Holly was saying earlier, there are these distributive questions that are difficult to answer and that I think really make all the difference when we're evaluating politically the kind of scenarios you're talking about, right? So if India or the People's Republic of Bezosistan starts flying these missions into the sky, they can spray the sulfur, and maybe somewhere, temperature will temporarily be depressed, right? But what happens to rainfall? And what happens, and where does that happen to rainfall, right? If Burkina Faso has a drought, right, do they lay it at the feet of these nations or rogue billionaires or whatever the scenario is? Where are we at with the attribution science and with the modeling of, and hopefully at some point, actual experimental results that allow us to say how the whole world system, much more broadly than temperature, responds to these kinds of technologies. In the absence of answers to those questions, I think, you'd have a lot of people guessing at who's responsible for what climate-wise after somebody has sprayed sulfur into the atmosphere. And I think, that's the stuff of conflict, right? You could imagine great power conflict, or you could imagine just a kind of breakdown in sorts of Paris Agreement type regulatory frameworks that allow us to cooperate on climate policy. But either one of those, I think, is clearly a step back, if not a disaster deeper than that.
So conceivably, one of the side effects, the unintended effects of doing SRM might be either more or less rainfall than typical in a region, it's an interesting thing to think about, as a lawyer from a legal perspective, the idea of an act of God, oftentimes a weather event or a earthquake or something is an out with respect to liability, because who on earth could be responsible? And now we're talking about being able to control these things, these events, which used to be only considered to be kind of above human intervention, that could really have direct impacts on most likely his more marginalized communities than not. I was reading, I think, Femi, you writing about this other aspect of this, which is that different countries have a different investment in getting to a different temperature. That everyone might not agree on what the global temperature should be or how much carbon should be removed to get a certain kind of result. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, different levels of temperature rise carry different risks for different parts of the world, obviously, right? So small island developing states, for example, are going to be in major trouble if the sea levels rise. Russia, not so much, right? Some of that is directly an issue of temperature. So, if it turns out that you can go sunbathing in Siberia or something, it's not the worst thing in the world, as opposed to if we're talking about wet bulb temperatures in India, for example, where the temperature gets so hot that people literally burn to death in their own skin, right? Those are two different levels of risk that have to do with temperature. But there's also all this downstream stuff, sea level rise, risk of flooding, risk of hurricane intensity, so on and so forth. And so I think, what we end up talking about, whether it's carbon removal or even just the regular old mitigation lowering emissions concentration, is that we have a part of the world which, partially for reasons of latitude, but largely for reasons of few centuries of colonial history, are largely insulated from, comparatively speaking, not in an absolute sense, right? Things are going to be messed up everywhere. But comparative to, Central African Republic, right? Russia and Germany and Canada and the US have less to lose, right? And I think that's really kind of the basic distribution of risk that all these other political issues are downstream of. And I think trying to put it back in that geopolitical standpoint is important, right? We talk a lot about what the corporations get out of talking about carbon removal or talking about geoengineering. But what people don't talk about as much is that, a couple of years ago, for example, there was a UN resolution to study carbon revolution, solar geoengineering that was blocked by the United States, Saudi Arabia, United States under Trump, Saudi Arabia, and Brazil under Bolsonaro. Because from a nation state perspective, more people getting a handle on what's going on in carbon dioxide removal and geoengineering was against their interests. So, you have some bad actors in the nation state space who are against even researching those things. And you have some bad actors in the fossil capital space who are very for researching those things. And I think, we just kind of have to ask direct questions about the science, right? What is the there? And based on what we want and not what those bad guys or those other bad guys want, how should we feel about carbon removal? How should we feel about geoengineering?
So, Alex, are any of those questions being asked by the kind of climate activist community, or do you still feel like there's hostility toward climate technology as a way to meet the moment?
Of course, the climate movement is a broad coalition, and there are differences in it, but by and large, some of the more vocal and influential parts of it remain hostile to these things. I think that the moral hazard concern about researching these things remains a prominent argument, and I think that that there's an austerity mindset, which is sensible. When we aren't even able to get the meager, we aren't even able to get the meager amount of money that centrist think tanks say is necessary to decarbonize. That if you can't even get that, and if you have Wall Street and private equity and all these other sectors aligned around the need for these things, and you can't muster the political will for that, then every single dollar that you can muster ought to go to proven mitigation techniques rather than to things that we may only pan out 10 years from now and may only prove absolutely necessary if the mitigation techniques fail. So I think at this moment, that is the dominant political current, and I think you've seen this become a wedge issue for a lot of groups, where even talking about these things is seen with some skepticism, that it may be a hint that you are surrendering to the fossil fuel companies, or that you are already prematurely assuming that mitigation at the rate that is necessary and that's being called for will fail.
Oh, so you're telling me that I made it through the Glenn Greenwald, Nathan Robinson debate without being canceled, but this is the episode that's going to bring me down.
It's a heated argument. Femi and I have spent some late hours on Twitter defending our climate bona fides together. So it may be so.
All right. Heated, you say? Well, puns intended. Holly, I want to ask you a little bit about the history of this movement in this conversation, because it does seem like people are more open to the conversation now, perhaps in part because it looks like traditional methods of just cutting carbon are not going to get us to the keeping under the 1.5 degrees Celsius raise that we're supposed to be avoiding. And that even if we were to cut all emissions today, we'd still be up Schitt's Creek. But historically, my understanding is, and please, elaborate, that there have been certain cultures within the climate movement that have been generally antagonistic to technology more broadly, and that's part of where the skepticism has come from.
I think so, and it's not hard to understand why that's the case, is just looking at industrial technology broadly and who it's impacted over time. So, you asked this great question about skepticism, and working through it, I think we should definitely hold on to our skepticism and keep it dear and really use it and apply it. But also that these technologies are too important to leave to the hands of, the fossil fuel companies to shape their future. And I say that because in 2018, speaking to the history question, there's this kind of inflection point because the IPCC published this special report on 1.5 degrees saying that to meet these temperature targets of 1.5 and probably also 2, we need to remove some amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So I think our focus shouldn't be on yes, no on particular technologies, because the question's really about the social relations around those technologies. And so if we can shift the focus from not what technologies are okay and which are taboo, but to how should we use these technologies? Who should profit from them? How are the risks mitigated? Those sorts of questions, I think, will be in a much stronger position for a better future.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but it was at one point the case that the climate movement was really dominated by groups that weren't always quite so focused on the human impact of climate change, that were much more focused on keeping natural spaces green and beautiful, and some that went as far as to say we shouldn't, let's close the national parks because humans are ruining the national parks, and there's a kind of for lack of a better word, uber crunchy granola kind of veneer to the climate movement. And now we're moving into a place, hopefully, that is a lot more conscious of the fact that there are very real, very dramatic human costs that are being prioritized more than they have been in the past. Femi, you've written a lot in this area, and I'm really intrigued by the overlap that you perceive between questions of colonialism and reparations and the climate movement. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're writing about with respect to climate and reparations?
So basically, what I'm trying to do, or at least how I see it, is racial justice to me has to do with accumulations as well, right? This is a language and a way of talking that we readily use when we're talking about emissions, right? But for the same reasons, right? It's not just what we're doing this year, but what we did all the years leading up to this year. For those same reasons, we should be thinking about the accumulation of institutional power, the accumulation of military power, right? And how those things are distributed in the world because of all the years up until now. And environmental risk and the other things that travel with environmental risk, food security and housing security, and the likely political responses to the kinds of climate displacement that are kind of on the way. I think those are things that fit in that same kind of historically informed framework. And so the way that I think about climate policy from that starting point is to think, well, what's the good way? We have to redistribute, right? Because these distributions are bad. They say only people in these arbitrary parts of the world, and with these arbitrary racial designations, get to have anything like security and social protection, right? That's a question of redistributing. And so the question from there is just how do we redistribute and in what areas of policy? And that really has been the question across climate policy. Loss and damage exists because, global South nations are like, you have to take into account how climate impacts us differently based on, where we're situated historically and where we're situated in this political order. The question of sustainable development goals and which countries are going to contribute what amount of emissions cuts to this global project of climate crisis. That's a distributive question, right? It's a question of, who's going to take on what level of labor and burdens to do this thing. And, in all of these senses, in all of these areas of climate policy, we see the same pattern that is, I think, kind of built into racial capitalism, which is that the benefits of these kinds of changes get consolidated upwards and all the risks and all the burdens get shifted downwards, right? So whether it's Africa having 75% of the land that was marked for the bond challenge and reforestation, or whether it's global north-based renewable energy companies sapping up all of the green cash that's floating around as a result of the kinds of efforts that we're claiming to take towards decarbonization. But we have to figure out better distributions than that. And, the Caribbean community of nations, the coalition of Latin American organizations, Pacto Ecosocial del Sur, have all talked about things like debt cancellation, so that places in the global south have the fiscal space to make different non-extractive decisions about how they're going to develop their economy, and have the space to develop in sustainable ways, or, we might not even like the word development at that point, but, ways to meet people's needs that don't go through this extractive system of fossil capital that we've set up over the past few centuries. And that's a distributive question.
Am I right to be kind of pessimistic and cynical about how those kind of distributive questions are going to be answered?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's totally pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, right? We should figure out what we want, right? And that still leaves the question of what we can actually expect to get and what we should try for, and et cetera, et cetera. But we shouldn't decide something is bad or not worth thinking about because, we don't think the other side will give it to us, right? I think that, let's at least start from a place where we consider victory.
I'll consider it, but here's the thing, and I want to open it up for everyone, and kind of a free for all in these last few minutes. I was told, and a lot of leftists who are understandably frustrated with how the Democratic primary ended, that at very least a vote for Biden was a vote to save us from climate disaster, right? And I had now notoriously a little bit of a disagreement with Noam Chomsky on this show about the extent to which Biden would do the bare minimum required for us to meet these kind of basic IPCC goals, right? And obviously something is better than nothing, but in a climate context where arguably you will meet these climate cliffs, these warming cliffs where you get cataclysmic consequences once you meet certain thresholds, if that bare minimum isn't enough, then there's an argument that it's not much of a cudgel in terms of getting people to the polls, right? And if you are endeavoring to apply political pressure, then that political pressure should at very least demand as a condition of your vote that certain goals are met. And so I had a hard time getting people to kind of be straight with me about whether or not Biden is doing enough. I know that part of the problem is things are moving currently and in the works, and the infrastructure bills, the two of them that exist for reasons that are beyond human comprehension, what the outcome of those things are going to be. But I wonder, we're kind of in a cloud of climate pessimism. I want to start with you, maybe, Alex. What your perception is of whether or not that particular political bargain of, vote blue no matter who, because at least it saves us from a climate disaster, is panning out.
Certainly at this point in time, there's ample reason for frustration with the way that things have gone down. Putting aside everything that we've discussed so far about what should come after and in addition to full mitigation, the initial package that the White House proposed was 5 times smaller than even what, again, both progressive and centrist and Republicanly, a think tank being led by Hank Paulson was saying was necessary for federal spending to hit these goals. So they undershot what Hank Paulson was calling for, and we're quite open about this. I published part of a call that I had a recording of that Gina McCarthy, the president's domestic climate czar, had with environmental justice groups and climate justice groups the day before the rollout of the infrastructure package. And, she pretty much said, prepared to be disappointed on some things, but this is important, and we should all get behind it. I am not the sort of person who thinks that that any amount of mitigation and avoided climate disaster should be disregarded or taken for granted. 4 degrees of warming is better than 5, and 3 is better than 4, and 2 is better than 3, and 1.5 is the best we have for ideal at this point. So anything that gets us along that pathway is really important. And I think what's important about the conversation that we're having right now is that we should be thinking, and progressives should be thinking, beyond this, about what they want to happen if that initial bet and that bargain does not pan out as it was initially sold ahead of the 2020 election. And hedging against that, I think, is a much more constructive use of that energy and that frustration than what I think is often the case, which is, kind of internal squabbling or browbeating, or frankly, a kind of like chic nihilism about, well, it's the apocalypse and we're headed for Mad Max anyway, which is an extraordinarily privileged, idea to indulge in the first place, I think.
Well, I have seen there has been I think an elevated degree of direct action from these climate groups and other progressive groups around these climate issues, right? There were the demonstrations up at the Capitol over the past couple of weeks. It does feel like there's a level of adversarial politics, let's say, that's happening around this issue than maybe that we've seen around some of these other progressive disappointments over the last few months. But I think the point that you raise is a good one, which is ultimately, will there be political consequences for Democrats for reneging on this kind of issue? And, I've said my piece plenty on this show about the kinds of political consequences that voters have at their disposal to, leverage in the absence of union power and other kinds of or organizations that used to hold more weight in the near past. But I want to ask the two of you, what hope do you have for these kinds of technologies, given that it seems like even the activists, even the leading left edge of the climate movement isn't really so open to considering these kind of technological geoengineering interventions?
It's an interesting question. In a way, I feel like the response I should start with is just not much, right? I don't think that, the development of any technology, whether it's a fancy new solar panel or a new direct air capture facility or something like that, I don't think any technology has in and of itself, the capability to do the thing that we need to do, which is change the outcome that our social system is trying to achieve. Right? That's not ultimately a technological issue. It's not an issue of technical capacity. It's that there's immense technical capacity in this country, and it's used to insulate landlords and corporate executives and their various, friends and allies in political high places from the political effects of every kind of crisis, whether it's COVID, climate, policing, or what we're going to be experiencing over the next few decades, which is the compound, overlapping crisis built out of all of these and many others, right? And until we produce a kind of political system, until we produce a kind of political culture where there actually is something in it for the elites, right? And they can't just provide huge coronavirus bailouts to them and their friends when things get bad and give everybody else a stimulus package of rubber bullets. Until we produce that political outcome, it doesn't matter what technology we have, right? So in a way, this kind of conversation isn't really here nor there. I think the base building conversation of, what kinds of power we're going to figure out how to wield in the absence of the kind of union power that maybe produced the New Deal. That's really the conversation that's going to decide what these technologies mean and what they don't mean.
Yeah, I mean, we had Kate Aronoff on the show recently. She's written this book that, this is reductive, but, argues that we're not really going to get the kind of climate solutions that we need under capitalism. There's just a conflict of interest there that can't really be strategically overcome. Holly, how do you face that reality? How do you keep yourself from being a climate pessimist and stay working in this space? Or do you have a plan for a full revolution in the next year or so?
I think in the near term, these technologies will be developed, but maybe they'll be developed in other countries that are serious about their net zero climate goals. Because when you say we're going to be net zero says we're going to balance some amount of remaining positive emissions with some amount of negative emissions from carbon removal technologies. Well, how much? New York State said, okay, 85% will cut, and then the 15% that's left over can be with carbon removal within New York State. So they're looking at, New York State's forest capacity. They're looking at carbon tech broadly and trying to invest in that. So I think, a place that's smart and is thinking about net zero and actually says, okay, let's figure out how we do this, is going to develop carbon removal. But it'll just be this kind of small boutique thing. I don't think it's going to be climate significant unless it's really deployed by the state and arranged by the state. And we're not there yet, but we should make that, part of our demands.
Are there other countries that are taking this more seriously?
I think in general, the discussion is in some ways more advanced in Europe, particularly in Scandinavian countries that have just gone farther on this kind of net zero roadmap than we have.
Are there people who stand to profit a considerable deal from developing this technology more quickly? I mean, what are the kind of market incentives for, private companies pursuing this?
I mean, right now there's removals that are, exchanged in the voluntary market. But I think that in the next few years, we'll see other governments, probably not ours, but who knows? I mean, formalize some of these requirements. I think that sectors like, forestry, agriculture are definitely looking at this. I think it could be amazing for workers to be building some of this new infrastructure, particularly workers that are employed in the fossil fuel industry that could be working in carbon removal instead.
Yeah, I think a point that Ryan made during his Rising segment that Ryan Grimm made was that, we consider it to be a real stimulus when we invest a bunch of money to get, Americans to build fighter jets or what have you. And those kind of energies and efforts could be deployed, putting people to work in this green sector, making, investing in building these kinds of technologies. And it's just a matter of political priorities and a choice we can make as a community if we so desired. I want to thank all three of you for joining me this evening, and I want to give you an opportunity to let our listeners know where they can find more of your work and find you on the social medias. Let's start with you, Alex.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This was really fun. I am, you can find my work on HuffPost.com, and you can find me on Twitter at Alex C. Kaufman, Kaufman.
Awesome. And Femi?
I don't tweet as much as I used to, but I'm on Twitter at Olúfẹ́mi O Táíwò. And I have a website that has other stuff that I write, olufemiotáíwo.com.
Okay, great. And Holly?
Yeah, I'm at the University at Buffalo, and I have a book coming out this fall with Verso called Ending Fossil Fuels, Why Net Zero is Not Enough. So if you want to hear more about the net zero thing, managed decline, carbon removal, it's all on there.
Okay, fabulous. Thank you all so much. Thank you for listening, audience. And as always, keep the faith. Hey, YouTube, don't forget this is a podcast. To get full episodes, including ones that are behind a paywall, go to patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. To get more episodes, please do subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and like this video.